Charles Morrison had always been a man of routine. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., he would wake up in his modest apartment on Elm Street, brew a single cup of black coffee, and read the local newspaper while eating 2 pieces of buttered toast. His life was predictable, safe, and utterly unremarkable, exactly how he liked it. At 52 years old, Charles worked as a librarian at the Riverside Public Library, where he had spent the last 28 years of his life. He knew every book on every shelf, could locate any reference material within minutes, and had helped countless students complete their research projects. The library was a sanctuary, a place where everything had its proper place, and order reigned supreme. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October, Charles's carefully constructed world was about to crumble like ancient parchment in his trembling hands. The letter arrived with the regular mail delivery, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements. Mrs. Henderson from the apartment downstairs had signed for it, mentioning casually that it looked important: thick cream-colored paper, formal seal, and Charles's name written in elegant script across the front. What made Charles's breath catch in his throat wasn't the expensive stationery or the mysterious sender's address. It was the bold red lettering stamped across the envelope's center: "Do not read." Charles stared at those 3 words as he sat at his small kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through his window and casting long shadows across the letter. His coffee grew cold as he turned the envelope over and over in his hands, studying every detail. The return address read Whitmore and Associates Legal Firm, with an address in downtown Chicago, a place Charles had never been, dealing with people he had never met. Why wouldn't anyone send him a letter with explicit instructions not to read it? The contradiction was maddening. If they didn't want him to read it, why send it all? Charles's logical mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He thought about his parents, both deceased for over a decade. His father, Robert Morrison, had been a quiet man who worked at the steel mill for 40 years before retiring. His mother, Margaret, had been a seamstress who spent her evenings reading romance novels and tending to her small garden. They had lived simple lives, never mentioning any connections to Chicago law firms or mysterious legal matters. Charles had no siblings, no close relatives except for his elderly Aunt Martha, who lived in a nursing home 3 states away. His social circle was limited to his co-workers at the library and Mrs. Chun, his neighbor who occasionally asked him to water her plants when she visited her grandchildren. As the morning progressed, Charles found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. He called in sick to work, something he had done only 3 times in his entire career, and spent the day pacing around his apartment, the letter sitting on his kitchen table like an unexploded bomb. The rational part of his mind told him to simply throw the letter away. If someone didn't want him to read it, then obviously he shouldn't read it. But the human part of his mind, the part that had been dormant for so many years under layers of routine and predictability, was screaming with curiosity. By evening, Charles had worn a path in his carpet from kitchen to living room and back again. He had picked up the letter dozens of times, holding it up to the light to see if he could make out any text through the thick paper. He had even considered steaming it open, reading the contents, and then resealing it, but that seemed like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. That night, Charles lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those red letters, "Do not read." What kind of information could be so dangerous, so sensitive, that a law firm would send it with explicit instructions not to read it? Was it some kind of psychological test? A mistake? A cruel joke? He thought about all the mystery novels he had shelved over the years at the library. In fiction, letters like this usually contained earth-shattering secrets, hidden inheritances, family scandals, or revelations that changed everything the protagonist thought they knew about their life. But this was real life, and Charles Morrison was just an ordinary librarian with an ordinary life. Or was he? For the first time in years, Charles began to question the narrative he had built around his own existence. Had his parents really been as simple and straightforward as he remembered? His father had sometimes received phone calls late at night, conversations conducted in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when Charles entered the room. His mother had kept a small locked box in her dresser drawer that she claimed contained just old jewelry, but Charles had never seen her wear any of the pieces from it. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Charles's mood perfectly. He sat at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, staring at the letter for what felt like the 100th time. His hands shook slightly as he picked it up, and he noticed for the first time how heavy it felt. This wasn't just a single sheet of paper. There were multiple pages inside, maybe even photographs or documents. Charles's mind wandered to his childhood, searching for any clues he might have missed. He remembered being 7 years old and asking his father why they never visited any relatives on his side of the family. His father had grown quiet and said something about complicated situations and some things being better left in the past. At the time, Charles had accepted this explanation without question. Children often did. But now, 45 years later, those words took on a different meaning. What complicated situations? What things were better left in the past? The more Charles thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about his father's history. Robert Morrison had rarely talked about his childhood, his own parents, or his life before meeting Charles's mother. When pressed for details, he would change the subject or find urgent tasks that required his immediate attention. Charles remembered one particularly strange incident from when he was 12 years old. A man had come to their door late one evening, asking for Robert Morrison. Charles had answered the door and called for his father, but by the time Robert arrived, the man was gone. His father had stood in the doorway for a long time, looking up and down the street with an expression Charles had never seen before, fear mixed with something that might have been guilt. "Who was that, Dad?" Charles had asked. "Nobody important," his father had replied, but he had checked the locks on all the doors and windows twice that night before going to bed. These memories, buried for decades under layers of ordinary life, now surfaced with startling clarity. Charles began to wonder if his father had been running from something, hiding from someone. Was this letter connected to whatever Robert Morrison had been trying to escape? The weight of the envelope seemed to increase with each passing hour. Charles found himself unable to eat lunch, his stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. He tried to distract himself by organizing his already perfectly organized bookshelf, but his eyes kept drifting back to the kitchen table where the letter waited. By mid-afternoon, Charles had developed a headache from the stress. He took 2 aspirin and sat down in his favorite armchair, trying to approach the situation logically. What were his options? Option 1. Throw the letter away unopened. This would respect the explicit instruction not to read it, but Charles knew he would spend the rest of his life wondering what he had missed. The curiosity would eat away at him like acid. Option 2. Contact the law firm directly and ask them to explain why they had sent him a letter with instructions not to read it. But what if they refused to talk to him? What if opening that line of communication triggered something he wasn't prepared for? Option 3. Open the letter and read it, accepting whatever consequences might follow. This option terrified him most of all, but it was also the only one that would give him answers. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Charles found himself gravitating toward option 3. The not knowing was becoming unbearable. He was a librarian. After all, his entire career had been built around finding information and providing answers. How could he live with himself if he threw away what might be the most important piece of information he would ever receive? But every time he reached for the letter, his hands began to tremble. Not just a slight shake, but violent tremors that made it impossible to maintain his grip. It was as if his body was rebelling against his mind's decision, some primitive survival instinct warning him that opening this letter would change everything forever. Charles had lived his entire adult life avoiding change. After his parents died, he had inherited their house, but chose to sell it and stay in his small apartment rather than deal with the upheaval of moving. He had been offered promotions at the library that would have meant more responsibility and higher pay, but he had turned them down because they would have disrupted his routine. Now, at 52 years old, Charles was being forced to confront the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his life might be wrong. The letter represented a door to a past he had never known existed, and opening it might reveal truths he wasn't prepared to handle. As darkness fell outside his window, Charles sat at his kitchen table with the letter directly in front of him. His hands continued to shake as he reached for it, as if they possessed their own intelligence and understood the gravity of what he was about to do. The red letters seemed to glow in the lamplight. Do not read. But Charles Morrison, quiet librarian and man of routine, had already made his decision. Tomorrow, he would open the letter and discover what his father had been hiding for all these years. Tonight, he would try to sleep, knowing that by this time tomorrow, his carefully ordered world might be nothing but ruins around his feet. The trembling in his hands grew worse as he touched the envelope one last time before going to bed. Whatever secrets this letter contained, whatever truth it revealed about his family's past, Charles knew there would be no going back once he broke that seal. His life as an ordinary man was about to end. What would emerge from the ashes remained to be seen. The morning light filtering through Charles's bedroom curtains brought no relief from the anxiety that had kept him tossing and turning all night. He had dreamed of his father standing in shadows, reaching out as if trying to warn him about something, but the words were always too muffled to understand. Charles woke with the distinct feeling that he was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. After his usual routine of coffee and toast, though both tasted like cardboard in his mouth, Charles positioned himself at the kitchen table. The letter sat before him like a silent challenge, the red warning still bold and forbidding in the morning light. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope, but this time he didn't set it back down. The seal broke with a soft tearing sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. Charles's heart hammered against his rib cage as he slowly pulled out the contents. Several typed pages, what appeared to be copies of official documents, and at the bottom, a collection of old photographs. The cover letter was written on official letterhead from Whitmore and Associates. Charles's eyes scanned the formal language, but certain phrases jumped out at him like physical blows. Estate of Vincent Castellano, inheritance proceedings, biological son, witness protection program, your father's true identity. Charles set the letter down with shaking hands and stared at the wall for several minutes, trying to process what he had just read. According to the law firm, his father, Robert Morrison, had not been Robert Morrison at all. His real name was Vincent Castellano, and he had been a key witness in a major organized crime investigation in Chicago during the 1970s. The trembling in Charles's hands spread to his entire body as he picked up the photographs. Black and white images of a man who looked remarkably like his father, but younger and dressed in expensive suits, standing next to people Charles didn't recognize. In some photos, the man was shaking hands with men in similar suits outside what appeared to be upscale restaurants and nightclubs. In others, he was seated at tables in smoky rooms, engaged in intense conversations with faces that had been partially blacked out. One photograph in particular made Charles's breath catch in his throat. It showed his father, or Vincent Castellano, standing next to a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. Someone had written on the back of the photo, Vincent and Tommy DeMarco, 1972. The name DeMarco sent a chill down Charles's spine. Even he, isolated as he was from current events beyond his library walls, had heard that name in connection with organized crime. Charles continued reading the legal documents with growing disbelief. According to the files, Vincent Castellano had been an accountant for several businesses that were fronts for illegal activities. When a federal investigation began in 1973, Vincent had agreed to testify against his former associates in exchange for entry into the Witness Protection Program. The program had given him a new identity, Robert Morrison. He had been relocated to a small industrial town in Pennsylvania, where he met and married Margaret Walsh, Charles's mother. The federal marshals had monitored their family for the first few years, but as the immediate threat decreased and key figures in the crime organization were either imprisoned or died, the active protection had been gradually reduced. What made Charles's hands shake even more violently was the realization that his mother had known. According to the documents, Margaret had been fully briefed on her husband's true identity before their marriage. She had chosen to build a life with a man whose past could have put their entire family in danger. A separate document detailed what had happened to the people Vincent had testified against. Most had been convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. But Tommy DeMarco, the man from the photograph with the cold eyes, had escaped conviction on a technicality. He had been released in 1979 and had reportedly spent years trying to locate Vincent Castellano. The file contained a newspaper clipping from 1985, 12 years after Vincent entered witness protection. The headline read, "Former crime boss Tommy DeMarco found dead in Chicago hotel room." The article was brief, stating that DeMarco had been found shot execution style, apparently the victim of internal disputes within his organization. Charles realized his father had lived with the constant fear of discovery for over a decade, never knowing if someone from his past would show up at their door. The locked doors, the mysterious phone calls, the reluctance to talk about his history, it all made sense now. But why was Charles receiving this information now, nearly 40 years after his father's death? The answer lay in the final pages of the document. Vincent Castellano had accumulated significant assets before entering witness protection, money that had been held in trust by the federal government until it could be safely distributed. Due to bureaucratic delays and the complex nature of the case, those assets had remained frozen for decades. Now, with all the original players either dead or too old to pose a threat, the government was finally releasing Vincent's estate to his surviving family members. Charles Morrison was the sole heir to over $2 million, along with a safety deposit box in Chicago that contained additional documents and personal items that Vincent had been forced to leave behind when he disappeared. Charles set the papers down and walked to his bathroom, where he splashed cold water on his face and stared at himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him had the same brown eyes as the man in the photographs, the same stubborn jawline. But now Charles could see something he had missed before, a resemblance to Vincent Castellano that went beyond basic facial features. There was something in his posture, a way of holding his shoulders, that matched the confident stance of the man in the expensive suits. Charles had always wondered where certain traits came from: his quick head for numbers, his ability to read people's intentions, his instinctive understanding of when someone was lying to him. These weren't skills typically associated with librarians, but they would have been valuable assets for someone working in Vincent Castellano's world. Returning to the kitchen, Charles picked up the phone number listed for the law firm. His hands were still trembling as he dialed, and it took 3 attempts to get all the numbers correct. "Whitmore and Associates, how may I help you?" The receptionist's voice was crisp and professional. "This is Charles Morrison. I received a letter from your firm regarding the estate of Vincent Castellano." There was a pause. "I see. Please hold while I connect you to Mr. Whitmore." The wait seemed endless. Charles paced around his kitchen, the phone cord stretching and recoiling with his movements. When a man's voice finally came on the line, it was warm but serious. "Mr. Morrison, this is James Whitmore. I appreciate you calling. I imagine you have many questions about the information we sent you." "I don't understand," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why now? Why send me a letter telling me not to read it if you wanted me to know this information?" Mr. Whitmore sighed. "That instruction was added by federal authorities, Mr. Morrison. Even now, there are protocols in place regarding your father's case. The do not read marking was meant to give you a choice, to remain ignorant of your father's past, if you preferred, or to accept the responsibility that comes with knowing the truth." "What kind of responsibility?" "Your inheritance comes with certain complications. There are people who worked with your father who are still alive, though most are elderly and pose no real threat. However, by claiming your inheritance, you would be acknowledging your connection to Vincent Castellano. Your name would appear in legal documents that could potentially be accessed by individuals with sophisticated resources. Charles felt his world spinning. Are you saying I'm in danger? Not immediate danger, no. But anonymity has been your protection for 52 years. Once you step forward to claim your father's estate, that anonymity ends forever. The weight of the decision settled on Charles's shoulders like a heavy coat. He could walk away from all of this, throw away the letter, destroy the documents, and return to his quiet life as a librarian. The money and whatever secrets lay in that safety deposit box would remain buried forever. But the alternative meant embracing a legacy he had never known existed, accepting that his entire understanding of his family had been built on carefully constructed lies. It meant admitting that the man he had mourned as a simple steel worker had actually been someone completely different, someone who had moved through dangerous worlds and made enemies who might still remember his name. There's something else, Mr. Whitmore continued. Your father left you a personal message. It's in the safety deposit box in Chicago. He recorded it before entering witness protection, hoping that someday he would be able to explain everything to you directly. Since that never happened, Charles closed his eyes, imagining his father, Vincent, sitting in a bank vault decades ago, speaking to a son he might never see again, trying to explain choices that had torn his life apart. What happens if I decide not to claim the inheritance? Then everything remains as it is. The money goes back into government accounts, the safety deposit box contents are destroyed, and Charles Morrison continues to exist without any connection to Vincent Castellano. It would be as if this conversation never happened. But Charles knew that wasn't true. He could not know what he had learned. Even if he walked away from the inheritance, he would spend the rest of his life wondering about the man his father had really been, about the message waiting for him in Chicago, about the family history that had been kept hidden from him. I need time to think, Charles said. Of course, but I should tell you, there's a deadline for claiming the estate. You have 30 days from the date of our letter to make your decision. After that, the opportunity disappears forever. Charles hung up the phone and sank into his chair, staring at the photographs spread across his kitchen table. 30 days to decide whether to remain Charles Morrison, quiet librarian, or to step into the shoes of Vincent Castellano's son. The trembling in his hands had stopped, replaced by a strange sense of calm. For the first time in his adult life, Charles Morrison was faced with a choice that would fundamentally change who he was. The safe, predictable world he had built around himself was already cracking. The only question now was whether he would let it crumble completely or try desperately to hold it together. Outside his window, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business. People walked to work, children played in the park. Life moved forward with comforting predictability. But inside Charles's small apartment, the past and present collided with devastating force. He picked up one of the photographs, his father shaking hands with a man whose face had been blacked out by federal censors. Vincent Castellano had been someone who made difficult choices under dangerous circumstances. Now his son faced the most important decision of his life. Charles Morrison had 29 days left to decide who he was going to be. For 3 days after his phone call with James Whitmore, Charles Morrison existed in a strange state of limbo. He returned to work at the library, but found himself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. Mrs. Peterson, who had worked at the circulation desk for 15 years, commented that he seemed distracted and pale. Charles mumbled something about not sleeping well and buried himself in the familiar routine of cataloging returns. But even surrounded by the comforting order of books and filing systems, Charles couldn't escape the weight of his father's secret. Every time he handled a book about organized crime or witness protection, subjects that had once seemed like pure fiction, he felt a jolt of recognition. His life had become one of those stories he had shelved countless times, where ordinary people discovered they were connected to extraordinary circumstances. On Thursday evening, Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. He drove to his parents' old neighborhood, parking outside the small house where he had grown up. New owners had painted it blue instead of white, and they had replaced his mother's careful flower garden with a modern landscape of decorative stones and geometric plantings. But the basic structure remained the same. The front porch where he had played as a child, the bedroom window where he had watched thunderstorms, the driveway where his father had taught him to ride a bicycle. Standing on the sidewalk in the fading October light, Charles tried to reconcile his memories with what he now knew. Every ordinary moment from his childhood took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of his father's true identity. The way Robert Morrison, Vincent Castellano, had always insisted they leave immediately when strangers approached them in public places. His reluctance to have his photograph taken. The fact that they had never taken vacations to big cities, always choosing remote camping trips or small towns where they were unlikely to encounter anyone from his father's past. Charles remembered asking his father once why they couldn't visit Chicago or New York like his friends' families did. Too crowded, his father had said. Too many people, too much noise. I prefer quiet places where you can hear yourself think. At the time, Charles had accepted this as simple personal preference. Now he understood it as a survival strategy. An elderly woman walking her dog stopped beside Charles on the sidewalk. "Are you all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." Charles turned to look at her and realized she was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had lived 3 houses down when Charles was growing up. She was much older now, her hair completely gray, but her kind eyes were unchanged. "Mrs. Rodriguez? I am Sharon Morrison. I used to live here with my parents, Robert and Margaret." Her face brightened with recognition. "Charlie, my goodness, look at you. I haven't seen you since your mother's funeral. What brings you back to the old neighborhood?" Charles struggled to find words. "I was just remembering things, thinking about my father." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. "Robert was such a good man. Quiet but good. Always willing to help when someone needed it. I remember when my husband fell off that ladder trying to clean the gutters. Robert was the first one there. Stayed with us until the ambulance came." She paused, studying Charles's face with the shrewd observation of someone who had lived through 8 decades. "You know, there was always something about your father that seemed careful, like he was carrying some kind of weight that the rest of us couldn't see. My grandmother used to say some people have old souls. They've lived through things that mark them, even when they try to start fresh." Charles felt his throat tighten. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing specific. Just a feeling." He was always watching, always aware of his surroundings in a way that seemed unusual for someone who worked at the steel mill. "And sometimes, late at night, I would see him standing at your front window, just looking out at the street like he was expecting someone." The old woman's words hit Charles like physical blows. His father had lived in constant fear, even in this quiet neighborhood, even after years had passed. Vincent Castellano's past had never truly let go of Robert Morrison. "Did he ever say anything to you about his life before he came here?" Charles asked. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "Your father wasn't much for talking about the past. But once, maybe 10 years after they moved in, we were having a neighborhood barbecue, and someone mentioned seeing a movie about gangsters in Chicago. Robert got this look on his face just for a second, like someone had walked over his grave. Then he excused himself and went home early." Charles thanked Mrs. Rodriguez and returned to his car, but instead of driving home, he found himself heading toward the cemetery where his parents were buried. The sun was setting as he walked between the headstones, looking for the simple granite marker that read, "Robert Morrison, beloved husband and father, and Margaret Morrison, devoted wife and mother." Standing before their graves in the gathering darkness, Charles felt the full weight of what he had learned. His mother's headstone proclaimed her devotion, but she had spent their entire marriage living with a man whose real name she could never speak aloud. She had raised a child while knowing that their family's safety depended on maintaining a carefully constructed fiction. What must it have been like for her? Charles wondered. To fall in love with someone whose past was so dangerous that he could never fully share it with her? To worry every day that someone from Vincent's old life might appear at their door? To watch her husband flinch at unexpected sounds and study every stranger's face for signs of recognition? Charles knelt beside the graves and placed his hand on the cold granite. I know who you really were, he whispered to his father's headstone. I know what you did to protect us. The cemetery was empty except for the sound of wind through the trees. Charles stayed until full darkness fell, trying to understand the choices his father had made. Vincent Castellano had given up everything: his name, his identity, his connection to whatever family he might have had, to keep his wife and son safe. He had worked at a job that was far beneath his intelligence and education because it provided anonymity. He had lived every day knowing that his past might catch up with him, but he had done it willingly to protect the people he loved. Over the weekend, Charles found himself researching everything he could find about the Federal Witness Protection Program. He spent hours at his computer, reading about the thousands of people who had disappeared into new identities, leaving their old lives behind forever. Most of the stories were about criminals who had testified against their former associates, but there were also innocent witnesses who had seen too much, family members who had been placed in protective custody because of their connections to dangerous people. What struck Charles most forcefully was how complete the transformation had to be. People in witness protection couldn't just change their names. They had to change everything about themselves. Their mannerisms, their habits, their entire approach to life had to be different enough that even close friends from their past wouldn't recognize them. Charles began to see his father's personality in a new light. Robert Morrison's quiet nature, his preference for routine, his reluctance to draw attention to himself. These weren't natural personality traits. They were carefully cultivated behaviors designed to help Vincent Castellano disappear completely. But there had been moments when the old Vincent showed through. Charles remembered his father's surprising knowledge of expensive wines, even though they rarely drank anything more elaborate than beer. He had known how to tie complex knots and had possessed an extensive vocabulary related to sailing, despite living hundreds of miles from any large body of water. Most tellingly, Charles now remembered that his father had always kept substantial amounts of cash hidden around the house. Emergency money, he had called it, in case they needed to leave quickly for some reason. All the pieces were falling into place, creating a picture of a man who had lived in two worlds simultaneously. The ordinary world of Robert Morrison, steelworker and family man, and the hidden world of Vincent Castellano, someone important enough that the federal government had been willing to give him an entirely new life. By Sunday evening, Charles had made his decision. He called James Whitmore's office and left a message saying he wanted to move forward with claiming his inheritance. When Whitmore called back on Monday morning, his tone was both pleased and concerned. "I'm glad you've decided to learn more about your father's story," Whitmore said, "but I want to make sure you understand what this means. Once we begin the process of transferring your father's assets, there will be a paper trail. Your connection to Vincent Castellano will become part of the official record." "I understand," Charles said, though his hands were beginning to tremble again. "I need to know what he left for me. I need to hear that message." "Very well. Can you come to Chicago this weekend? I'll arrange for you to access the safety deposit box, and we can begin the paperwork for the estate transfer." Charles agreed, even though the thought of traveling to Chicago, the city where Vincent Castellano's old life had unfolded, filled him with anxiety. After hanging up the phone, he sat in his quiet apartment and realized that he was about to step into his father's world for the first time. The trembling in his hands had become constant now, a physical manifestation of the fear and anticipation that coursed through his body. In 6 days, Charles Morrison would cease to exist as a purely ordinary man. He would become Vincent Castellano's son, heir to secrets that had been buried for 4 decades. Part of him wanted to change his mind, to call Whitmore back and say he couldn't go through with it. But a stronger part, a part that might have inherited more from Vincent Castellano than just his appearance, was hungry for the truth. Charles had lived his entire life not knowing who he really was. Now, finally, he was going to find out. The library where he worked suddenly seemed smaller, more confining. The apartment where he had lived for 20 years felt like a temporary shelter rather than a home. Everything in his carefully ordered world had taken on a provisional quality, as if it might all disappear the moment he learned what his father had really wanted to tell him. Charles requested Friday off from work, claiming he needed to visit his aunt in the nursing home. Mrs. Peterson expressed surprise. Charles never took time off except for genuine emergencies, but she approved his request without question. As the week progressed, Charles found himself studying his reflection more carefully, looking for traces of Vincent Castellano in his features. He practiced walking differently, standing straighter, tried to imagine what he might have been like if he had grown up knowing his father's true identity. The thought that frightened him most was the possibility that he might like what he discovered about himself. Charles Morrison was a careful, quiet man who avoided risks and confrontation. But Vincent Castellano had been someone who made bold decisions and accepted dangerous consequences. What if those traits were hereditary? What if learning about his father's past awakened something in Charles that had been dormant for 52 years? Thursday night, Charles packed a small suitcase for his trip to Chicago. As he folded his clothes and gathered his toiletries, he had the distinct feeling that he was packing for a journey from which he would never truly return. The man who came back from Chicago might have the same name and the same face, but he would carry knowledge that would change everything. Charles Morrison was about to meet his father for the first time, 40 years too late. The trembling in his hands had spread to his entire body as he realized that tomorrow would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. The train ride to Chicago felt like a journey through time itself. Charles pressed his face to the window as familiar Pennsylvania countryside gave way to the industrial landscapes of Ohio and Indiana, and finally, to the towering skyline of the city where his father's story had begun. With every mile that passed, Charles felt himself moving further away from the safe, predictable world of Charles Morrison and closer to the dangerous legacy of Vincent Castellano. James Whitmore met him at Union Station, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Charles recognized him immediately from his confident posture and expensive suit, someone who moved comfortably in the world of important people and significant money. "Mr. Morrison," Whitmore said, extending his hand. "Thank you for making the trip. I know this can't be easy for you." As they walked through the crowded station, Charles felt overwhelmed by the noise and movement around him. He understood now why his father had avoided cities like this. Too many faces, too many opportunities for unwanted recognition. Even after 4 decades, Charles found himself scanning the crowd nervously, wondering if any of these strangers might somehow be connected to Vincent Castellano's past. Whitmore's office was located in a gleaming downtown building that spoke of serious money and important clients. As they rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, Charles felt increasingly out of place in his modest clothes and small-town demeanor. When they entered the law firm's reception area, with its expensive furniture and original artwork, Charles realized he was stepping into a world that his father had once inhabited naturally. "Before we go to the bank," Whitmore said, leading Charles into a private conference room, "I want to show you something that might help you understand your father better." He opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the polished table. Charles saw copies of newspaper articles from the 1970s, FBI reports with heavily blacked-out sections, and court transcripts that mentioned Vincent Castellano's testimony. "Your father wasn't just any witness," Whitmore explained. "He was the accountant for 3 major crime families in Chicago. He had access to financial records that exposed decades of money laundering, tax evasion, and connections to legitimate businesses that serve as fronts for illegal activities." Charles studied a newspaper headline from 1973. "Star witness testimony brings down organized crime network." The article was accompanied by a photograph of a courthouse, with Vincent Castellano visible in the background, his face turned away from the camera. When Vincent agreed to testify, he knew he was signing his own death warrant if he stayed in Chicago, Whitmore continued. The people he testified against had resources, connections, and very long memories. The federal government didn't just offer him witness protection. They practically insisted on it. Charles picked up one of the FBI reports, struggling to read through the heavy censoring. But certain phrases stood out: credible death threat, extensive organized crime connections, high-value witness requiring maximum protection. What made him decide to testify? Charles asked. Whitmore paused, choosing his words carefully. According to the records, Vincent witnessed something that crossed a line for him. The exact details are still classified, but it involved violence against innocent people, including women and children. Vincent had been willing to overlook financial crimes, but he couldn't stay silent about murder. The weight of this revelation settled over Charles like a heavy blanket. His father hadn't been a criminal who testified to save himself. He had been someone who risked everything to seek justice for people who couldn't protect themselves. There's more, Whitmore said, pulling out another document. Vincent used his access to financial records to help the FBI recover money that had been stolen from pension funds and union accounts. Millions of dollars that would have disappeared forever were returned to working families because of your father's testimony. Charles felt a surge of pride mixed with grief. Vincent Castellano had been a hero, but he had paid the ultimate price, losing his identity, his career, his entire life, except for the new one he built with Margaret Morrison. After reviewing the documents, Whitmore led Charles to the Merchants Bank building, an imposing structure that had been serving Chicago's business community for over a century. In the safety deposit box vault, surrounded by walls of numbered metal containers, Charles felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Box 1247, the bank officer announced, producing a long metal container that required both Charles's key and the bank's master key to open. Inside, Charles found carefully organized compartments containing items that Vincent Castellano had considered too important to leave behind. There were photographs of people Charles didn't recognize, probably Vincent's family from before witness protection. There were documents in Italian that appeared to be immigration records. And there were several pieces of expensive jewelry, including a gold watch with an inscription that read, "To Vincent, with love and respect, Papa." But what drew Charles's attention immediately was a small cassette recorder and a single tape labeled "For My Son." With shaking hands, Charles placed the tape into the recorder and pressed play. After a few seconds of static, his father's voice filled the small room. Not the careful, measured voice of Robert Morrison, but the confident, articulate voice of Vincent Castellano. "Charles, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and you've learned the truth about who I really was. I hope you can forgive me for the lies, but I want you to understand that every choice I made was to protect you and your mother." Charles closed his eyes, listening to the father he had never really known speak words that had been waiting 40 years to be heard. "I was born Vincent Antonio Castellano in 1932 to Italian immigrants who came to this country with nothing but hope for a better life. My father, your grandfather Antonio, worked 18 hours a day building the railroads that connected Chicago to the rest of America. He wanted me to have an education, opportunities he never had." Vincent's voice carried a mixture of sadness and determination as he continued. "I got that education, became an accountant, and eventually found myself working for people who seemed successful and powerful. It took me years to understand that their success came from causing pain to others. By the time I realized what I was really part of, I was in too deep to simply walk away." Charles opened his eyes and looked around the vault, trying to imagine his father recording this message, knowing he might never see his son again. "The hardest part wasn't giving up my name or my career. It was knowing that you would grow up never really knowing who your father was. I wanted to tell you about your grandfather, Antonio, about the strength and integrity that runs in our family. I wanted you to understand that the Castellano name meant something before I made mistakes that forced me to bury it forever." Vincent's voice grew softer, more personal. "When you were born, Charles, I held you in my arms and made a promise that you would never have to pay the price for my choices. Everything I did after that moment was to keep that promise. Robert Morrison was never fully real to me. He was a costume I wore to protect the people I loved most." Charles realized he was crying, tears falling onto the documents spread before him. "I know you'll have questions about what kind of man I really was," Vincent continued. "The truth is complicated. I did things I'm not proud of, but I never hurt innocent people. When I finally understood that my silence was enabling violence against families like ours, I knew I had to act. The FBI agent who convinced me to testify told me that my information could save lives. That's when I knew I had no choice." The tape continued with Vincent describing the inheritance he was leaving, not just money, but properties and investments that had been held in trust for decades. Charles learned that his father had been far wealthier than he ever could have imagined, with assets that had grown substantially during the years they were frozen by the government. "But more than money," Vincent said, "I'm leaving you a choice. You can take what I've left you and disappear again, create a new identity just like I did. Or you can reclaim the Castellano name and build something good from it. Your grandfather Antonio believed that a man's name was his most valuable possession, not because of what it could get him, but because of what he could make it mean." Vincent's voice was growing tired now, as if recording the message was taking a tremendous emotional toll. "Whatever you decide, Charles, remember that you are my son, but you are not bound by my mistakes. The blood that runs in your veins comes from people who crossed an ocean to build better lives for their children. That courage, that determination to do what's right even when it's difficult, that's your true inheritance." The message ended with words that Charles knew he would remember for the rest of his life. "I loved you every day of your life, even when I couldn't tell you who I really was. Be the man I always hoped you would become, and know that your father was proud of you before you were even born." Charles sat in the quiet vault for a long time after the tape ended, processing everything he had learned. The trembling in his hands had stopped completely, replaced by a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. When he finally emerged from the bank, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Chicago streets. Charles looked up at the towering buildings around him and realized that this city no longer felt foreign or threatening. It was part of his story, part of his history. James Whitmore was waiting outside, giving Charles space to process what he had discovered. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. Charles took a deep breath. "Like I finally know who I am," he said. Over dinner at an expensive restaurant that Vincent Castellano might have visited in his previous life, Charles and Whitmore discussed the practical aspects of his inheritance. The money was substantial enough that Charles would never have to work again if he chose not to. The properties included several buildings in Chicago that had appreciated dramatically in value over the decades. But what interested Charles most was a small foundation that Vincent had established before entering witness protection, a fund designed to help families of crime victims. It had been dormant for 40 years, but with proper management, it could be revived and expanded. "Your father wanted to do more than just escape his past," Whitmore explained. "He wanted to make amends for it." That night, alone in his hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, Charles made his decision. He would not disappear again. He would not hide behind the name Charles Morrison for the rest of his life. Instead, he would honor his father's memory by finishing what Vincent Castellano had started. The next morning, Charles began the legal process of reclaiming his family name. Charles Antonio Morrison Castellano would return to Pennsylvania long enough to settle his affairs, sell his apartment, and resign from the library. Then he would come back to Chicago and use his inheritance to build something meaningful, something that would make his grandfather Antonio proud. Standing at the window of Whitmore's office, looking out at the city where his story really began, Charles felt the last traces of trembling leave his hands. For the first time in his life, he was exactly who he was supposed to be. The letter marked "Do Not Read" had changed everything, just as he had feared it would. But instead of destroying his world, it had given him a new one where the quiet librarian became the keeper of his family's true legacy, where Vincent Castellano's son could finally step into the light.